Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Now, it's been a while for a couple reasons. One of them has been sound quality, and so I'm trying a new microphone and we'll see if this helps. Today, we're heading into the election in the US. It's very ironic, amusing, perhaps even ominous. The election day is the same day as Guy Fawkes Night. So we're going to be voting at the same time the British celebrate thwarting the plot to blow up Parliament with large amounts of gunpowder. At the same time, this is definitely an explosive election year. We have a lot of arguments about who is the lesser evil. And very few arguments about whether the candidates are evil, except for some people who seem to be almost cult-like in their following for either Trump or Harris. So I'm going to wade into one of the big issues that's hanging over the election. And I'm going to give a viewpoint of somebody who's lived in many different places in the world. The issue is abortion, okay? And my viewpoint is less about policy than it is about dialogue. But I think that if you understand my points about dialogue, then some understandings about policy might be understood from these. They don't really fall into either of the two sort of extremes in the US. So the fundamental problem I see is that in the United States, the culture of law and government is based very much on a few Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke. And in particular, John Locke's natural right theory more or less underscores the entire abortion debate in the United States. John Locke says basically every individual has a right to life. Okay, that's the first right, and the most important one. The second one is everybody has a right to liberty, as long as it doesn't deprive another of the right to life. Okay? And then the third one is that everyone has a right to property, as long as it doesn't deprive others of liberty or life. And so you have this hierarchy of rights. Life is at the top, liberty as long as it doesn't deprive someone of life, and then property, which of course is very sacred in the US. So when we look at the abortion issue in the United States, what we are always told it is a conflict between this right to life and the right to liberty. And because the right to liberty can never supersede the right to life, the only argument we're allowed to have is at what point along development does this right to life attach? I believe this whole framing of the issue is in fact highly toxic. And I think discussions about abortion as an issue from a rights perspective make it almost impossible for people of different opinions to come together and find solutions which might actually work for everyone. So, I've lived in Southeast Asia. I'm currently a resident of both Indonesia and Singapore. These countries have very different approaches to this issue. I've also lived in Sweden and Germany. And one thing I've noticed in Europe is that Europeans look at this issue very differently than Americans do. And it's to the point where if you defend European policies, you come off as a radical right-winger in the United States. I mean, not just slightly right of center, but like, practically off the political spectrum. And the reason for this is there's no sort of constitutional codification of this rights hierarchy in Europe. Okay? The United States has this long history of intellectual liberalism, again, going back to Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. In Europe, this is one thread that has largely been discredited all the way back in the early 20th century. So, European politics works on a very different basis. Ignoring, of course, the UK, which, of course, also has a lot more liberalism in it than the rest of Europe. But no country in Europe is liberal in the sense that the United States is. So, in Europe, this is not seen as a natural rights issue in the same way that it is in the United States. Instead, it's usually seen as a conflict of interests problem. In other words, there are different social interests on different sides of this issue, and part of the job of good government is to figure out a solution that actually addresses all of those interests. So, this leads to some really weird circumstances. For example, the Council of Europe would condemn the United States Supreme Court for upholding abortion restrictions in Mississippi, which would be relatively mild compared to abortion restrictions that you see in many European countries, including France, Germany, Norway, Iceland, Finland, just to name a few. And the reason here, I suspect, has more to do with geopolitics than it does with philosophy, but it's, I think, also a little bit of either the Council of Europe doesn't understand American politics, or they don't understand how this issue plays out in American politics, or stuff like that. Because the issue in the Dobbs case, from a more European perspective, isn't limiting elective abortion to 15 weeks of pregnancy. After all, France and Germany limit to 12. And the Netherlands does to 16. So does Iceland, but Iceland also requires a formal reason given to have an abortion. Norway limits to 12. Finland requires a reason, and I think also limits to 16, if I remember right. Sweden limits to, I think it's 18 weeks, but you can get a social worker sometimes to give an extension to that time period. All of these limits would sound just horribly terrible to, say, Democratic Party voters. But they're not horrible in practice. They don't lead to all of the terrors that, frankly, similar restrictions would lead to in the US if they were just simply enacted as those restrictions. And the reason is that the United States actually does a bunch of things in this area very, very badly. Okay? You can talk about bodily autonomy all you want, but one thing that never includes is critiquing the social forces that coerce women into having abortions in the US, right? So you're not allowed to say, oh, well, it's a bodily autonomy issue, that low-wage workers can't afford to have another child, okay? But in reality, that is, right? Similarly, paid maternity leave on a level that might be reasonably common in Europe, i.e., half a year, maybe even a year of paid leave, isn't something that can be really advocated within this whole framework, right? Once you talk about abortion as a natural rights issue, it has to be separated from all other connecting issues, and you can no longer sort of craft a package that actually supports everybody, right? So what ends up happening in Europe is everybody comes together, all of the interests kind of get pooled, right? And you get policies out that meet everybody's interests, right? And another thing which comes out of this is that if there's an actually medically required abortion, that there are then processes for handling that properly. This is another thing the United States does very, very badly, right? And so this is so what I'm doing with this is that because we talk about this as a conflict of rights, we're unable to make good policy. Okay? We're unable to come together and say, well, you know, maybe 12 weeks for an elective abortion is fine. But we need to make sure that if there is a medical emergency, that that can be handled appropriately and that we have appropriate processes set up. You know, we saw Kamala Harris recently say, oh, well, it can't be possibly true that women who are 9 months pregnant would ever go in for an elective abortion. That may in fact be true. But the fact that medically necessary abortions are forced through the elective abortion system in the US makes this into a big problem in a way in which it wouldn't be in Europe. So in the US now, you're only allowed to, there's no way to separate it. This abortion is medically necessary versus this one is elective. Well, that is the basis of a lot of the approaches that are taken in Europe. Of course, in Southeast Asia, it's very different. And one thing I almost always point out is that topics relating to family structures are very, very cultural. And family structures are also very economic. So it makes no sense to take what works in one place and just simply supplant it somewhere else. However one looks at the abortion issue, I think that there are two major challenges I would encourage everybody to think about in the US. The first one is to shift from thinking about this in terms of rights to thinking about this in terms of interests and the fact that the governments, both at the state and federal level, need to work on addressing those interests. And the second thing I would challenge Americans to do is to stop trying to internationalize this and other culture war issues. Makes no sense. Okay? Instead, try to learn from what other cultures do, even if you disagree with them, see what you can learn from, and figure out how to make your own system better. Because part of the reason the abortion argument, in my view, is so vicious in the US is because governance in areas that need to take care of things like family is so bad. So that's my 2 cents on this discussion. As I say, I'm not going to take a universal position on this issue. I could in relation to specific countries I've lived in, but for purposes of this conversation and the need to de-internationalize and strike the language of rights from the conversation, I don't think a position is needed or helpful. So that's what I want to talk about today. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.